as long as you understand the basics of your axis and the placement of your leads. The basis of your axis and the placement of your leads. Incidentally, with axis, we will take it one step further at a later time, where we'll take the z-axis as well, which is recordial leads. And we will also take the bundle branch stuff a little bit further when we get into the hemi blocks. So we're not leaving that by the wayside. That's just a little bit more advanced stuff that we're going to cover soon. Okay? So in relation to AMIs, you guys already understand the specific part of the EKG that you're looking at related to myocardial injury or myocardial ischemia. What is the section of the EKG that you look at?
ST.
The ST segment. Excellent. So try to make some connections here, right? When it comes to EKG, the EKG is a translation and a average understanding of muscle depolarization and repolarization. Correct? You understand that, right? Yes? So every single cell, every single autorhythmic cell has an individual tracing of what's happening at the cell membrane, right? And every single contractile cell has a tracing of what's happening to that cell at the cell membrane, right? This is what an EKG is measuring. We're only, instead of just taking it one cell at a time, there is a whole bunch of cells doing a whole bunch of activity, and as those ions are flowing, our electrical current is flowing, right? Because we have calcium and sodium movement, we have positive changes that are of electricity, and when we have potassium moving, we have negative movement of electrons and electricity. Yes?
Yes.
Not electrons, but electricity, ions. We understand that, correct? Okay, so when that's the case, in this whole process, where is it that oxygen is required?
To pump things back out to repolarize the cell on the ATPS.
Be more specific, or give me more information.
Well, if this...
The repolarization pumps out the ATPase pumps to pump out the sodium and the potassium back in.
So what's oxygen used for?
The ATPase pumps.
What's oxygen used for? What's that?
Creating ATP.
There you go. It's used in the production of ATP, right? It's used along the electron transport chain in the Krebs cycle, right? Not in the Krebs cycle, but in the mitochondria, to create the ATP. Does that make sense?
Yes.
We all good there? Okay, so it's for the production of ATP. So if you have a situation where you have deficient O2, then what's going to happen to your production of ATP?
It's going to go down.
It'll decrease, right? We'll go from an aerobic production of ATP to an anaerobic production of ATP. Now you go back to your fuel systems that you learned about in A&P, right? And talk about what kinds of fuel systems produce more ATP, right? And it's a combination of the use of oxygen and the use of glycogen, right? The use of fats, the use of proteins. And whether or not we have or don't have oxygen helps to determine which fuel system that we happen to be in at any given time. And probably, I hope that in your A&P class, maybe they would have used some sort of an analogy of a race of some sort, and they would talk to you about what fuel systems you're using if you're doing, say, a 40-meter dash, or a 100-meter dash, or 400, or a mile, or a marathon, or an ultramarathon, and in each of those different stages, you have a different fuel system that your body is using, both because of nutrients and because of O2, right? So for example, if you're gonna do a 40-meter dash, if you're gonna do if you're just running a 40 someplace, or 40-yard dash, right? How much oxygen are you using an ATP being produced in that amount of time?
Not a lot.
Not a lot.
Yeah, so you having a system that relies on oxygen and the Krebs cycle would suck, because you'd never be able to run it, at least not with any speed, right? So we have to have a different fuel system for that. You hopefully talked about the creatine and other types of systems at that point in time, which I'm not gonna get into right now. But the point is that the use of oxygen or the lack of oxygen makes a difference in ATP production, in the process of ATP production, right? Okay, so when we think about something going wrong, the process of depolarization, the process of muscle contraction does not in itself require energy. The process of resetting the muscle in order to contract again is where the energy is necessary. That's both on the depolarization side and on the muscle protein side, right? The act of releasing the power stroke that you had, the coupling that you had between the actin and myosin, was the breakdown of ATP, right? Which is why when someone dies, they go into rigor mortis, because you're not producing the ATP to release the contraction. It has nothing to do with the contraction to begin with, it's the release of contraction where that energy is necessary. The same thing is true at the cell membrane when we're trying to reset where the ions are going. We're trying to pump those ions against their gradients, right? We're trying to pump potassium where?
Back in,
Back in. We're trying to pump sodium where?
back out.
Back out, right? Those are against their gradients when we're pumping in there, which means we require some sort of energy to force those ions to go where they're supposed to go. And that's what is happening with the sodium potassium ATPase pump, and it's what's happening to the calcium ATPase pump on the SR when we're trying to resequester calcium. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So where energy is used is on the resting or repolarization side of things, whether we're talking mechanically or electrically. And today we're going to talk electrically. Does that make sense? Okay, so with that being said, if the heart is becoming ischemic, then we shouldn't see any problem with the depolarization of the atria, right?
Correct.
Because the depolarization is just related to the concentration gradients of our sodium ions and that are just traveling down their gradient. So the depolarization is fine. We don't get to see what happens with ischemia of the atria because all of the repolarization stuff is hidden within reason. Then we have this QRS complex. We don't see anything with the QRS complex because once again that's related to what?
Depolarization.
Yeah, the depolarization process, which has no energy production related to it. So therefore, oxygen, or in this case, a lack of oxygen, isn't going to affect, at least initially, the depolarization process. So once again, we still don't see anything. Where we see it is now we're starting to do the repolarization process, right? And as we start to do the repolarization, now we start to have an issue. With the repolarization, things start to be delayed because some of the muscle cells aren't getting the necessary nutrients that they need, so they're taking longer to go through their repolarization process. Does that make sense? Therefore, the repolarization system that we have starts working differently. We start seeing it differently. And when it comes to ischemia, we start to see that by seeing a depression right here. A depression because things are coming back to resting membrane potential, but it's happening slowly because not all the cells are able to repolarize as quickly as the other cells because some of them are fine and are repolarizing normally and some of them are not. Does that make sense? So we see one of a couple things. Either we see an ST depression or a flipped T wave, or a combination of both. Does that make sense?
I'm not really picking up how electrically, if it's a slower process, wouldn't there be more electrical activity? I mean, I'm guessing obviously not.
More in terms of time
Uh-huh,
of an event that already takes plenty of time.
uh-huh,
So it's not related to more, it's related to, in this particular case, right? Yes, in some aspects, what you're saying is, wow, it's taking longer for this cell to repolarize, so shouldn't more time happen? But that's not happening in the QS complex. That's only happening in this window of time for the repolarization. You might see some elongation of the repolarization process there anyway. But the bigger thing is that some of the cells are already repolarized and some of them are not. It takes longer for their HPH pumps to come into play and start that process. So yeah, we do have some problems with repolarization taking a little bit longer. We do have some problems with some cells not repolarizing repolarizing properly. But it's not related to QRS, right? It's only related to this time frame in here that we have. And we do see some changes there.
and so with the flipped T wave, I'm thinking of it as like the direction of the electrical activity is taking a different route.
That's correct.
Okay, and that's just because we don't have a whole bunch of ATP, it's more electrical activity is happening elsewhere?
Yeah, so what's the normal depolarization process? Depolarization, what's the normal directional flow of depolarization?
Rage in the
Oh,
left ventricle.
Yeah,
And that's not related to the heart, related to the muscle itself.
Out,
Oh, outside.
in to out,
inside to out.
Good, so endo,
because it repolarizes, or it
To epi.
depolarizes out.
right, that's the depolarization, the typical depolarization.
Uh-huh.
And the typical repolarization is the other direction, right? That's our typical repolarization process. Now we have a couple of things that are gonna come into play that make this more difficult. One is that we have some issues with where we start to have ischemia. This directional repolarization system doesn't work as much. So this is supposed to be the most ready to repolarize. And this is supposed to go fast, and this is supposed to go slow, right? In the repolarization. But in relation to the heart, now we have to start taking into consideration which of these muscle masses tend to have more problem, right? And then that gets into the actual blood flow in the heart. So talk to me about blood flow in the heart.
So the coronary arteries are on the epicardium,
Okay?
and then they fuse into it, and there's something about like they have crossover.
Yes, where? What direction does the branching go? Do you understand what he's saying right now?
No, you say it
Here's
again.
what he's saying.
What happened to our?
He's talking about these now. Is what he's talking about, okay? Right?
Yeah.
All right, so he's talking about the arteries that are on, the coronary arteries that are on the outside of the heart that are feeding the heart muscle, right? Okay, what are they doing?
So they have arterioles,
Yep.
right, that go down into the tissue, but there's like, because they branch, there's some crossover, so that hearts are being perfused by two different sets of arterioles.
Okay, so I'm gonna draw, and you tell me if I'm drawing what you're saying.
Okay.
What he's saying is that there is an artery, right? And then there are branching arteries off of that artery. Yes?
Uh-huh.
And then there are branching arteries off of those arteries. Yes?
Mhm.
And as you can see, there are places where there's crossover, where this artery branched into smaller arteries, this branch branched into smaller arteries, and some of these branches off of this artery crossed over to some of the branches with this artery. So in other words, this muscle cell is getting a blood supply by more than one arteriole.
And we're talking endocardium.
I'm not talking that. I'm just saying what he's saying in terms of the branching process, yes?
Yeah.
Is that good? Okay. My question, back to Andrew,
Yeah.
is where is this branching occurring?
I think it's occurring in the endocardium.
Good?
So,
Yeah, so when we look at our branching of the heart, now I'm writing blood vessels here. The blood vessels tend to do this kind of thing.
it's a better innervation towards the endocardium.
Good? So where is heart muscle well perfused? Off of this picture.
In the endocardium.
In the endocardium.
Okay? What else supplies heart muscle with blood supply? There's another set of blood vessels,
Capillaries?
not capillaries. There's another set of blood vessels that makes you think of Shakespeare.
To be.
Well, you
To
stumped
be.
me.
No, wrong line.
Two Brutus.
Nobody can remember it?
If not to, I don't know.
What other Shakespeare you guys have? Come on.
Come on, spit it out. Henry?
Who's Shakespeare?
Which play?
Hey, if
Is-
Cody's not here, no one else is left.
Year before
Okay,
Shakespeare's
whoever
time?
said that.
Nobody? Nobody?
Nobody.
Nobody? Aw, come on. Do you remember the Thebesian vessels? Back in AMP2?
You got a lot more
Come on,
AMP
man.
two than we did.
Oh, man,
You
okay.
got a lot of AMP knowledge.
So what is right here?
In that-
What did I just circle?
Your heart?
the
Thank
eight-
you. What is right there?
Right, the ventricle or atrium inside of the
Be
chamber.
more specific. Yes, the whole thing is a ventricle. What is it?
It's inside the chamber.
So therefore, what would I have just circled?
Blood.
Blood. Okay. So there are some blood vessels, some coronary vessels that come right out of the ventricle itself, right into the heart.
That makes sense.
Going which
Yeah,
direction?
seems really-
Into.
But not very far.
Yeah. That's pretty cool.
Well, yeah, I do not remember learning that in AMP2.
How does that not just tank your stroke volume?
Because
You
they're
dilate all those little
completely-
veins.
But they're tiny. But they're very tiny, and so you're not talking about a major supply of blood flow, but you are talking about these little tiny vessels that do originate on the ventricle walls that then keep that endocardium once again well perfused. So when you think of that for just a minute, now I'm going to draw this over here. Here's my endo. Here's my epi.
Do those pop into the same places that the coronary arteries pop into
No.
to leave?
No, they just filter into the endocardium a little ways, and they allow for fresh blood supply in that endocardium.
And then where does that blood go?
And then it goes into the interstitium, and then right back into the
Okay.
venous.
That's
So
what.
that question we
So the
keep
same
getting
place
on
that the
our
coronary-
quiz is actually
Yeah,
correct.
it dumps right back into the
Right?
coronary
I
sinus.
thought it was total bogus.
Okay, now, think about this for just a minute. Andrew, because we're having the conversation with you, right?
Oh, yeah.
We just went through depolarization this way. We just went through repolarization this way
Yeah.
under normal circumstances, right?
Right.
This over here is supposed to be a slightly slower depolarization. This over here is supposed to be a slightly faster depolarization. Repolarization. Catch me when I say the wrong word. You're smart enough to do it. Right?
Yep.
So that we get backwards repolarization in an effort to make sure that this cell, when that cell depolarized, it would wait to depolarize again. It would stay in its refractory period longer to make sure that these were set first. So that when it did send its signal again, those epicardium tissues were ready to receive it. And it's another backup system to make sure that we don't get into a fibrillation of some sort, right? We're all good with that so far, right? This definitely is AMP2, and I have enough shaking of the heads, yes, that you're good, okay? So, but here's the thing. If our heart starts to become ischemic, where does it become ischemic first?
Epicardium.
Oftentimes over here gets the ischemia first, because as we get closer to the endocardium, it tends to have a lot of overlapping blood supply, and it tends to be more fresh with O2. So therefore, what normally was fast becomes slower. And as that starts to happen, we start to get into a repolarization that switches directions. Does that make sense?
Thus flipping the T wave.
Thus flipping the T wave. And we also don't, it doesn't elongate things so much, because these are ready to go pretty quickly. They're not ready to go as fast as they always were, but by the time this would have gone, this is ready to go anyway. So it does start to go faster, fast enough that we don't see a huge elongation of time, but still longer than normal, which means our endocardium has time to set that repolarization process up. Does that make sense? Hence the flip T wave and the depressed ST segment. Does that make sense? The depressed ST segment, because this tissue is staying in the negative the hyperpolarization time longer, and the flip T wave, because it takes a different pathway for repolarization than we are used to, until it gets back to normal. Yes, ma'am?
Okay, so looking at that image that you just drawn, you couldn't note yeah, okay. So where your finger was just a second ago, that looks like it could be an upright T wave that's just depressed below the isoelectric line.
But it's not.
But it's not.
Because
It's
then
not
it-
inserted T wave right there.
Correct.
Okay, so like,
How do you figure that
yeah.
out? What else can you use to help you know where your T wave is?
Find the baseline.
When
PT
we turn the baseline.
What's right here? Or right here?
Grid.
Different leads.
Different leads. That's right.
Oh.
You can start looking at other leads to get your exact timing down of things. And as you get your exact timing down of things, you can start to go, okay, I know where that T wave is in this bad area of the heart. That's why we have different.
Because in selective areas, it's going to flip.
The areas that show the ischemia. That's correct. Because the areas that aren't ischemic won't show ischemia.
They'll
How is
different-
that timing gonna be the same?
window,
That lead is gonna be delayed versus not delayed in other leads. So you couldn't just
It's
take your
not-
calipers and go to the lead where it's upright and not depressed, caliper that interval out and then move it to that lead.
You can. Because it's not delaying the overall end result process by much. It's just delaying those cells long enough that it ends up flipping the direction that the repolarization goes. But not by,
And
we're
that's
not
just-
talking about it much.
That's just because of like the level of ischemia or,
Yeah, the amount of slowness leading up to that will determine the level. So how much depression you have determines how ischemic that tissue is, because that's a representation of how much of the tissue is ischemic.
so if you reach the point where the cells were super dead and were no longer conducting anything,
Then you wouldn't have ischemia anymore.
you would just have an axis deviation away from your ischemia.
Correct.
Okay.
We're good so far? Yeah? Okay. So in essence, this is related to more time. we're spending more time in that hyperpolarization stage, which is why we are depressed, why we're in the negative for that week, right? Now, as injury starts to occur, we have cells, if we have cells that are actually injured, then we have a situation where they are not repolarizing. We have some cells that are simply not repolarizing, or at least not repolarizing properly, okay? And in this particular case, they get depolarized, and they can't repolarize like they're supposed to. The process is not working like it's supposed to. And so once again, we don't see any problems in the depolarization stages, but what we see is we see a longer period of time of depolarization. So the ST segment stays above the baseline because those cells are more positive because they're simply not repolarizing at all like they're supposed to. We might still have flipped T waves because of the repolarization process when it eventually does occur is often occurring backwards, once again for the same reasons that we just discussed. But the level of ST elevation is related to the level of damage that is being done. And this is damaged tissue. This tissue, it's not dead tissue yet, but it is tissue that is not using ATP pretty much at all in those tissues, like they're supposed to. Like they're supposed to.
So, the dead tissue, is it still depolarizing?
It's not dead tissue yet.
Gotcha.
It's not dead tissue yet. If you have ST elevation, the tissue isn't dead. It is just extraordinarily inefficient and not working properly.
Gotcha. So it'll still depolarize, keeping in that phase
Yes,
longer.
but it is not dead tissue yet, which is really important to understand. We call it a myocardial infarction. And those words literally mean heart muscle death. But if we were to be more technical and correct about it, we'd be calling it heart tissue dying rather than heart tissue dead. Does that make sense?
Heart tissue distress, or distress,
Well,
not arrest.
dead.
The way that we call it is injury.
Yeah.
It's being injured.
So an ST elevation is more critical than ST depression?
Absolutely. ST elevation means that that tissue is not just ischemic, it's injured. So for example, if you are an athlete and you're wanting to work out a lot to really build a lot of muscle mass, right? There is a window of time
Good muscle.
where you are stressing your muscle and causing little micro tears and damage in it, but they're not bad. They're for the purposes of building, of hypertrophy and building muscle and this kind of thing. But if you take it just a little bit further than you should have in overtraining, then you might take a muscle cell and instead of having some micro tears in the proteins that cause more muscle mass to be built, you take it to the point where the proteins are released and get something called rhabdomyolysis. Right? Rhabdomyolysis, what's rhabdomyo?
Or rapid muscle? Rapid mind? I can't hear.
You don't.
Rhabdo. Rhabdomyo.
Something muscle.
Oh my goodness,
Something
this,
else.
this is AP1, and I know that you had it.
Rhabdo.
So we learn stuff in our anatomy.
Yeah, seriously.
I have a
Don't
patient in
remember
the
that.
ER who
Oh,
has
yeah.
some kind of damage from kickboxing that has given him chronic pulmonary embolisms and he can no longer do cardio like for the rest of his life. Is that kind of this
This
idea?
is something that potentially could lead to it.
It was, yeah.
Rhabdo, what is it?
Breakdown.
Rapid.
Rapid.
Oh, I have nothing to do with
Rapid.
Oh my goodness, guys.
Rapid breakdown.
Skeletal muscle,
Breakdown?
lysis, we said that.
Breakdown?
Breakdown.
Rhabdomyolysis, the lysing, the breakdown of skeletal muscle. When you get to the point where you have rhabdomyolysis, you've got the breakdown of that skeletal muscle. That breakdown of that skeletal muscle will release proteins from inside your muscle cells to the extracellular matrix, and it's very, very damaging. In trauma, we have this in what syndrome?
Crushing
Crush syndrome.
compartment.
The biggest problem with crush syndrome is that we're crushing skeletal muscle. When we crush skeletal muscle, we are releasing proteins and phosphates and potassiums that are not supposed to be in the extracellular environment. Does that make sense? Okay. Good. So, it's the same thing here. We are in ischemia. That would be in an area where the heart muscle is definitely having a problem. It's definitely not receiving the nutrients that it needs. But the tissue itself is not injured. In a myocardial infarction, noted with our ST elevation, is where that heart muscle has actually been injured. It's not dead, but it is injured. And by injured, we mean the muscle proteins are not functioning correctly. The oxygen deprivation has gone to the point of not having enough ATP to complete the repolarization process in those muscle cells like they are in the other muscle cells. And we are one moment in that particular muscle cell or collection of muscle cells from being dead, from those muscle cells being dead. Does that make sense? Because they're still alive, you still get some transfer of ions through them. Because those channels are still alive, the cells are still working, the membrane has not broken down yet, so we still have an area where we do have some transfer of ions. It's just not efficient and terrible on the repolarization side.
Got it.
If we go one step further, where the myocardial infarction leads to actual muscle cell death, then we have no transfer of any ions through that muscle cell system. Because at that point in time, the membrane's broken down, the channels are broken down, the ions in that area were never put back where they were supposed to be, which means for that cell, equilibrium was met. Do you understand what I mean by that? Right? If you get to the point where your sodium ions on the outside and the sodium ions on the inside are equal to each other, then how can you have depolarization? Right? So equilibrium was met in those cells, the channels were met, had destruction to them, and the cell membrane had destruction to it. Those cells are now out of the mix altogether, electrically speaking. They're not part of the average anymore. They are completely out of the mix, which means if I have a place that has cells completely out of the electrical mix, then they're no longer in the electrical average, which means what happens to my axis?
Shifts.
It shifts because now I have more electrical average over here than I had before. Does that make sense? And because this stuff is all dead, electrically speaking, we have no electrical activity, then a camera that is hanging out right here, looking at that area, can't see anything electrically right there. Which means the next electrical thing it sees is what?
Going away.
Yeah, whatever's next over here. If this is my heart tissue, like this, and this used to go that direction,
All I can see is the septum.
but it's dead now, then we can't see anything there. So that means this camera sees the next thing that it can, which is this, which is going that direction. This wasn't seen before because this area right here hid it to that camera. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
But now it's not hidden to that camera anymore. Because it's not hidden to that camera anymore, we get to see that activity instead of here. This activity would have translated into what on the EKG?
The
Positive
deflection.
A
reflection.
positive
Can lead
deflection.
to.
But now, well, I just
In that-
happened to
in
drop
that
there,
lead,
but in
yeah.
that lead, wherever it doesn't matter where the lead is. But now, if this is gone, and that's what I see, then what will I see?
A negative deflection.
A negative
Negative.
deflection.
But you
At the
drew
beginning
lead
of your-
two, didn't you?
At the beginning.
I did, but I don't want you to say lead two, I could have drawn it over here.
Right, but you drew lead
And
two.
it would be at the Q, like a Q wave, you'd be seeing negative Q wave. At the
And I
beginning.
would see a Q wave, that's right.
Yeah,
That's correct.
because that's negative.
And so even though you're now looking through the dead tissue, you still get ST elevation?
No, so, excellent question. So now, or excellent comment, or whatever you're made there. We're moving now away from seeing, because now that tissue has nothing going on electrically. Because nothing is going on electrically, we don't see anything in the ST changes. Instead, all we see is that Q wave. That Q wave
That we didn't see before.
that we didn't see before because it was hidden by everything that's going on here is now apparent in that particular lead because it's seeing this activity over here. Not all leads will show Q waves. It depends on where the tissue is, where the damage is, right? Because not all leads have something on the other side that has tissue moving away from it. Okay, we good? So our sequence of events would be ischemia, would be ST depression, and a flipped T wave. That tells us that we're ischemic. Injury, and when we say injury, we're saying an acute myocardial infarction. What does acute mean?
Now.
Happening now.
Now, right? We often abbreviate things just MI. Hey, they're having an MI. But they're not just having an MI, they're having what kind of an MI?
Am I right now?
They're having an MI right now. So it's acute. With that one, we see elevations in our ST segment. And in death, we don't see any changes in the ST segment because there is no electrical activity in that dead tissue anymore. And instead we see a Q wave that develops in the living tissue, not in the living tissue. The Q wave develops because we're seeing the living tissue on the other side of our dead tissue.
And
And
the,
books will say this as, this becomes a window to living tissue. And electrically speaking, that's exactly what it is.
Why aren't you seeing a P wave of the living tissue on the other side?
Well, P waves come
Or
before
sorry,
Q
a
waves.
T wave.
T wave.
Well, you will. I just didn't drop out. You will. I only drew the QS complexes here.
Okay.
In the end, but I could finish this out. Is that helpful? Go ahead.
For the ischemia, is that always gonna, is that going to be a precursor to an MI, or could you make your heart ischemic just by exercising?
I'm not sure how to answer your question, so I'm just gonna answer it this way. Anytime your heart is ischemic, it is a precursor to injury. Okay? That doesn't mean that everything that causes ischemia will always lead to an MI. But anytime your heart is ischemic, it's a matter of how long is it going to be ischemic. So if you have an ischemic heart long enough, you will injure those cells. And as soon as you injure those cells, you're in an MI in that tissue.
So it's possible that you could see ischemia on your EKG, but the chief complaint is a respiratory distress.
Could be.
and once you fix the respiratory, it comes back.
Yes. Anything that's causing so anything that's causing the potential for, don't step on it wherever it fell. Okay. Anytime you have anything that's leading to the heart not receiving plenty of oxygenation will cause that heart to become ischemic. And that can lead it to have an MI. Absolutely. So let's put it this way. Let's say we have somebody that has pulmonary edema. And pulmonary edema, first of all, what kind of a problem is pulmonary edema? Is it a ventilatory problem or a respiratory problem?
Ventilation.
Respiratory. And is it internal or external respiration?
Internal.
External. Good. So we have an external respiratory problem. So we have pulmonary edema. We have an external respiratory problem. In an external respiratory problem, our issue is not getting good exchange of gases. If we don't get good exchange of gases, then our blood supply starts to become hypoxic. If the blood supply is hypoxic, then eventually the tissues will become ischemic. If one of those tissues that is becoming ischemic is the heart, then we have an ischemic heart. If the problem is not corrected and that tissue continues to be ischemic long enough, that'll send somebody into a cardiovascular event and they will have an MI. Y'all see that?
Good question.
Say that again.
I have a good question. So,
So how would
hypoxic
you-
blood, how, I guess it starts peripherally and then works its way in. How hypoxic would you have to be before it affects the heart? Or how long, I guess, would be?
Well, that depends on your activity level, right? It depends on what your cardiac output is at a
Yeah.
given time, your health level, that kind of stuff. It will say that your brain and your heart takes 75% of your oxygenation right off the top, right? Any blood supply that goes through the heart's gonna steal 75% of that because of how much it metabolizes over all your other tissue, unless you have working tissue someplace.
Pretty quickly.
This make sense? Okay.
If we have a cardiac arrest due to pulmonary edema, what do we do to fix the underlying cause?
What do you do to fix it? Cause?
CPAP and nitro.
CPAP?
Or
Suction.
Nitro.
nitro and or
Go to the hospital.
Lasix.
Diesel?
But if we're in cardiac arrest and doing compression,
That wasn't even no.
I added
Stuff to the fluid all at once.
what are the signs we're gonna see? Just diminished lung sounds?
You might see diminished lung sounds, you might see swelling, you might see some changes on the EKG that we'll discuss a little bit later.
Like swelling, you mean pedal edema?
Could be.
If it's right.
History. Okay. Okay.
Cool.
You'll see potentially some hypertrophy stuff on the
Wait.
EKG.
I'm sorry, that little doodle you did on the injury on that acute MI side,
Yeah,
the little T wave is hidden up in the elevation.
it depends. Sometimes you'll. Sometimes you will see something like this, where the T wave comes down. Sometimes you will see something like that, where the T wave is up high. It just depends on
Does
which
that
lead you're
indicate that
looking
it
at.
is worse seeing the inverted T wave because it's both
No.
injury and
No,
ischemia?
because that just completely depends on the lead that you're looking in, right? Because some leads are some T waves are supposed to be inverted in certain leads.
Right.
What denotes the level of tissue injury in a given lead is the height of the ST segment. The height of the J point.
Because,
The higher it is, it means the more tissue that has been damaged,
and is unable to relax.
unable to repolarize properly.
And you could say more leads with ST elevation, with potentially because you have more, that picture is being affected.
You often, the higher the ST segment, the more that it's usually translating across the,
To other leads.
to other concurrent leads. That's typically true. Okay, so,
So if I see someone with ST depression, if that's not like indicatively bad, like that could just be normal for them.
Oh, Jesus.
why would that not be bad? Is it good for your heart to be ischemic?
No.
It's really not.
So they need, if there's ST depression, they need to go to the hospital.
If they have ST depression, you'll most likely be traveling down a chest pain protocol of some sort and traveling them someplace, right? So if someone
See the
has,
cause for it.
right, that's kind of the sequence of events in cardiovascular disease, right?
Okay,
Somebody
so
else.
Yeah.
ST depression, we can't, that's not a STEMI. That's just like,
What does STEMI stand for?
It doesn't say.
Right there. Okay, so if someone, let's say someone has cardiovascular disease, they've been diagnosed with angina pectoris, and they are out mowing their lawn on a summer day, and they start to have a moment, right? Where they're having an anginal attack. If they're having an anginal attack and you arrive, they start to have chest pain, you arrive on scene, you look at them and you start going through history and you get your EKG done, and you see on the monitor something like that, where you've got ST depression of some sort. I don't care what the T wave is, I'm just getting the ST depression, right? You have ST depression that's happening there, right? You would also expect what related to their, okay, so first of all, what would be your general treatment protocol for this
12
person?
lead? Phone it.
Treatment protocol,
Oxygen.
not diagnostic protocol.
Oxygen, relax.
If it's
Treatment
below
protocol,
nitro,
First of all,
aspirin.
good.
fentanyl,
So nitro,
aspirin,
aspirin,
325, nitro 0.4.
okay.
Oxygen.
Oxygen if it's